Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin our webinar shortly. We want to give a little bit of time for participants to join the meeting. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for finding time today to attend our fourth IPA Power Hour webinar on CEJA's impact on utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites. My name is Megha Hamal and I am the Communications Manager at the Illinois Power Agency. To get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. A recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under About Us and Events, along with the PDF of the presentation slides sometime this afternoon. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end of the presentation to address these questions. To submit questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We have also enabled live transcript for the meeting today. If you wish to hide the live transcript, you may click on the live transcript button, then hide subtitle. In today's webinar, we will be covering utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites, procurement processes, successes and challenges with FEJA approach, key changes to utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites under CEJA, forward procurements and procurements under long-term plan. Our presenters for this session are Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel, Illinois Power Agency, Doug Stinner, Chief of the Planning and Procurement Bureau, Illinois Power Agency. I would like to now give you a quick overview on the IPA Power Hour webinar series, its scope, and upcoming Power Hour webinars. Power Hour is a newly launched series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Today's Power Hour will discuss utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites procurement process, like I mentioned, success and challenges with FEJA, and key changes to utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites under the new law, CEJA, and a quick snapshot of forward procurements and procurements under long-term plan. Future IPA Power Hour webinars will cover other topical areas impacted by Public Act 102-0662, which is the CEJA. So today we will not be covering items from Public Act 102-0662 related to stakeholder feedback processes related to the adjustable block program opening and the revised long-term plan development, specific program or procurement requirements, Issues outside the purview of the IPA, such as changes to rate making, changes to net metering, grant programs established and administered by the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, clean energy workforce hubs, electric vehicle and transportation incentives. Here's a quick snapshot of the upcoming Power Hour webinars. The next one will be our 5th Power Hour, which will be taking place on December 3rd. And it will be on the topic of creating a diverse and equitable energy workforce. This leads me to my next slide, which is a brief introduction to the Illinois Power Agency. The Illinois Power Agency is an independent state agency created in 2007. The agency duties include development and implementation of procurement plans for electricity supply for default service customers of electric utilities, development and implementation of other procurement plans, such as those to support at-risk nuclear plants, which includes zero emission credits and carbon mitigation credits, and implementation of the Renewable portfolio standard, which includes developing the long-term renewable resources procurement plan, conducting competitive procurements for utility-scale projects, and managing program for community solar and solar for homes and businesses. This concludes my portion of the presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to our Chief Legal Counsel, Brian Granahan.
Thank you, Megha. This is Brian Granahan. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel of the Illinois Power Agency, and thank you all for joining us again for another of our Power Hour series. So this is about the work that's being done by the Illinois Power Agency to support the development of new utility-scale wind and solar projects and new brownfield-site photovoltaic projects. And we'll go first through what we're discussing today regarding what we mean by new utility scale wind and solar projects. Go to the next slide. So what exactly are we getting at here? Well, first off is the scale of the project. So unlike the adjustable block program, which you've heard about in prior Power Hours, which supports community solar projects, which might be sited in a greenfield, but ultimately have customers subscribe to those projects, or distributed generation projects, which directly offset the usage of a given customer, like say rooftop solar. These are larger scale projects. And by large scale, the law had previously said over 2 megawatts in size. Now with recent changes through Public Act 1020662, it's projects over 5 megawatts in size. These projects and whether they can qualify for the Illinois RPS and thus receive support through state administered programs are subject to the geographic limitations found in section 175C1I of the IPA Act. What that really means is that they have to be in Illinois or in a state adjacent to Illinois and demonstrate, if they're in a state adjacent to Illinois, that they provide sufficient benefits back to Illinois residents. So how are these projects being supported? What is the state of Illinois doing to try to provide support to ensure that these projects are developed? Well, the primary mechanism is through a long-term contract for the sale of renewable energy credits, or RECs, from the project itself to an Illinois electric utility, with the payments for those projects, or for the RECs delivered from those projects, then made with the utility as the buyer and the counterparty. So ratepayers are essentially funding or supporting the development of these projects through collections on their utility bills, and that money is being sent to the project developers for the production of renewable energy credits and the delivery of those credits. And those credits are then ultimately counted toward the Illinois RPS in a demonstration of how much of our electricity is met through renewable energy. These projects are supported through competitive procurement processes. What that means is that much like our energy procurement processes, we receive a set of bids. Those bids are evaluated on the basis of price. And so long as the project qualifies and meets all project maturity requirements, we're choosing the lowest price bid to give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of new development. And then especially through the Future Energy Jobs Act, and now again through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, there's a focus on facilitating the development of new projects. So not just procuring RECs from projects that are this size, but trying to solve the but-for test. So but for the presence of the revenue certainty through this REC delivery contract, the project would not ultimately be developed. And that's how we can get the most out of this process and leverage ratepayer funds in the most effective way in the longer term. What is being procured, again, are renewable energy credits, or RECs. These are the environmental attributes of energy produced, but not the energy itself, decoupled from the energy and sold to say we've gotten a certain amount of our electricity from renewables. We have once in the past, as I'll get into, procured energy through these contracts back when the supply that we were meeting through the RPS was the same as the supply that we're meeting through energy procurements. That's no longer the case. The benefit for a project developer is if you have this contract in place from the state administered process, you're given revenue certainty that makes your project that much more likely to be successfully developed and especially financed. So why support these projects? Just a few notes here. Large scale renewables are a major contributor to decarbonize more diverse and more resilient energy portfolio. In other words, we can talk about decarbonization through the lens of, say, fossil generating facilities closing and reducing carbon output, but ultimately it requires these sorts of large scale renewables in addition to other things to try to take their place. So this is one of the legs in the stool as we move toward a clean energy economy. And today's Power Hour is about how Illinois state policy supports those projects' development. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through a little bit of a timeline of how the Illinois Power Agency and the state of Illinois has supported the development of these projects over time. So the next slide. There. So before the Future Energy Jobs Act, which took effect June 1st, 2017, the IPA utilized a competitive procurement process to support the procurement of RECs from utility scale projects. That competitive procurement process is born out of what we do to procure energy to meet the requirements of default supply customers, or those customers who haven't switched to a competitive supplier for their energy supply. We receive bids, we assess them on the basis of whether they qualify, we select them on the basis of price, but no bids can be chosen if they're above a confidential benchmark. So in the case of a renewable energy credit delivery contract, we're looking at that REC price that is bid in and saying that has to be below a certain threshold in order to even be considered for improvement. And then the information that's released after the procurements is fairly limited because this is born out of energy procurements where there's competitive information found and maybe what the actual bids were. So we only release the names of the winning bidders and the average winning bid price. Prior to FEJA, there was a preference for Illinois and adjacent states first, and then you look elsewhere. And the way that this process was funded was only through collections from those customers who remained on default supply. So if a customer chose service through a competitive supplier, was required to have service through a competitive supplier, we weren't ultimately benefiting from collections from those customers, and that left a lot of variance in what the RPS budget looked like year to year, which resulted in some challenges under contracts executed. We had a 25% by 2025 target. You hear that oftentimes in the RPS, that 25% of our renewables were needed to be met, or 25% of our energy consumption needed to be met by renewables by 2025, but that was only applied to the load of those customers who didn't switch to a competitive supplier. So going to the next slide, there was one major procurement that resulted in the development of new utility scale renewable energy projects in Illinois in the pre-FEJA area. And this was through the 2010 long-term power purchase agreements. These were 20-year bundled contracts of both RECs and energy for the development of new projects, primarily in Illinois and primarily wind projects. So by virtue of getting both the RECs and energy, the RECs were used to meet the state's RPS, meet that 25% by 2025 requirement, while the energy was under contract to meet the default supply requirements and reduce the amount that the IPA would otherwise be procuring energy in meeting those requirements. This procurement process provided revenue certainty for new project development. So if you were a wind project developer, you bid into this process, you had a bid that was selected, you now had this contract in hand that you knew you had revenue certainty that would give you the guidance that now I can go ahead and make the investments necessary in order to build this project. Now the costs of the projects need to be met, or the REC delivery contracts need to be met year over year through future years collections. So in any given year, you have collections associated with that delivery year, and you have costs associated with that delivery year's delivery of RECs, because ultimately those collections are being used to pay for those RECs. That created certain challenges because the amount of money you had to meet those obligations changed year over year. As more customers switched to competitive suppliers, that amount went down and eventually actually went lower than the obligations that were present. So some of those contracts had to be curtailed. This was a very unstable process because year over year, you simply didn't know what sort of money you had in the bank to be able to meet contract obligations that were fixed over time. And that really was one of the reasons that we ended up with the Future Energy Jobs Act, if we go to the next slide, that instituted a new approach to how the RPS was funded. Through FEJA, effective June 1st, 2017, the RPS is now applicable to all retail customer load, regardless of whether the customer takes supply from a competitive supplier. RPS goals and targets and the IPA's planning processes take into account all of that, all of the retail customer load, the 130 million megawatt hours or so that are ultimately each year's energy consumption in the state by retail customers of electric utilities. And funding increased proportionately because now all of those customers have a surcharge on their bills, a volumetric charge that then pulls those collections in and allows us to support additional project development. Through FEJA, there was also a focus on new projects, trying to make sure, again, that any money that was collected that was used to support the procurement of RECs from these utility scale projects ultimately was used to solve that but-for test. Okay, but for we were in a situation where this contract didn't exist, maybe the project would never be developed. Let's try to make sure that this money is leveraged in a way that's additive, that's incremental, that produces new project development and the economic development that comes within it. There's also wind and solar balancing found in FEJA to try to make sure that the amount of RECs we were procuring from wind and the amount of RECs we were procuring from solar never got too far out of line. Some changes to the adjacent state criteria as well, where now projects in adjacent states have to meet this public interest criteria, and how we apply that public interest criteria is explained through Chapter 4 of our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. So that regime took effect on June 1st, 2017, still a competitive procurement process. So it's not like the adjustable block program where it's an open enrollment. We're still taking bids, evaluating those bids on the basis of price, and selecting the lowest price bids. We conducted a number of procurement events after the enactment of the Future Energy Jobs Act. Those who know this space well know that we develop our long-term renewable resource procurement plan that had to be developed 120 days after the enactment of the Future Energy Jobs Act. But in the meantime, there were certain procurements required by law before that time. Those are what are called the initial forward procurements, conducted across late 2017, early 2018, to support the development of utility scale wind and utility scale solar projects before our long-term plan was even approved. And then there were additional forward procurements authorized through the plan itself. In terms of selected projects from those procurements, these are the projects that were placed under contract, and we'll break this down a little bit in future slides. We ended up with about 2,600 megawatts total of selected projects, with those projects then needing to be developed thereafter. Those projects then have the REC delivery contract in place. All but one of those projects is in Illinois. We talked a little bit in the prior slide about the size of these projects needing to be larger than 2 megawatts or larger than 5 megawatts. But across that 2,600 megawatts, we're talking about maybe 20 projects. So ultimately, these projects do benefit from economies of scale. And if they're being chosen on the basis of price, it tends to be the case that the larger projects are able to bid more competitive prices simply because they're able to achieve more benefits, more economies of scale. So we're really talking in many cases about 50 megawatt projects, 100 megawatt projects, 200 megawatt projects, large scale wind farms and solar farms being supported. And we'll get into in future slides exactly what that looks like right now in terms of the status of those projects, where they're located, and where they are in their development cycle. So go to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about brownfield-site photovoltaic procurement. So all of what I just explained was on utility scale projects and what things looked like before the Future Energy Jobs Act, what things looked like thereafter. There were no procurement requirements related to brownfield-site photovoltaic projects before the Future Energy Jobs Act. So this discussion is really just about what was brought to light through the Future Energy Jobs Act as of June 1st, 2017. So a quick overview about what we mean. What this does is essentially say, not just, okay, can we develop more utility scale solar, but where are we developing it? What other things are we getting out of it? Specifically, can we develop solar projects in a way that will also help us with remediation of blighted or contaminated land. So that's a little bit different way of looking at what can be done as we grow the clean energy economy in Illinois. And I think a lot of those principles are really reflected in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that passed back in September. They were maybe, this is kind of a precursor to that approach, where now we're not just asking about what is the scale of what we can do, but also how we can do it, where we can do it, and asking more qualitative questions that were maybe asked before. To qualify as a brownfield-site photovoltaic project, for purposes of these procurements, it's fairly straightforward. You have to be a solar project and you have to be sited on a brownfield site. Well, what does it mean to be sited on a brownfield site? Well, there's 4 different programs that you could be regulated by. Those are listed here. They're also found in Section 1-10 of the IPA Act. And essentially, if that site was regulated by any one of those 4 programs, and you had plans to build solar there and met certain project maturity requirements, then you could qualify that project for participation in this dedicated brownfield site photovoltaic procurement event. So as you go to the next slide. So there were targets in the law under the Future Energy Jobs Act for how many RECs we'd be receiving from brownfield site photovoltaic projects. All of the new project targets found in FEJA had this rhythm of do X amount by 2020, do Y amount by 2025, and do Z amount by 2030, not just for brownfield site projects, but also for new wind and new solar projects more generally. Brownfield site photovoltaic projects were only 2% of the overall photovoltaic target. So this wasn't a situation where we were talking about this being a huge contributor to the overall number of RECs that are procured to meet the Illinois RPS. And the resulting procurement quantities over time were 40,000 RECs by 2020, 60,000 by 2025, and 80,000 by 2030. Just to give you some sense of what that means in terms of installed capacity, let's assume maybe it's 550 megawatts to deliver 1 million RECs annually. Then you're talking about 55 megawatts in order to deliver 100,000 RECs annually. So really, to meet that 2020 requirement, you're talking about maybe 20 to 30 megawatts of new photovoltaics on brownfield sites. So it isn't a huge amount of development relative to what's been happening on the utility scale solar side. The process for selecting bids was the same as what we've used previously. Bids are selected on the basis of price. The project qualification was a little bit more complicated though, because now, as opposed to just saying, are certain project maturity requirements met? Is this entity posted collateral? Does this entity otherwise qualify? We're asking ourselves questions about whether that site ultimately is being regulated by the different programs that are laid out in the law. So that made for a slightly more complicated process in trying to figure out whether a given proposal ultimately qualified for this procurement. So we go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit here about some of the successes and challenges with the approach that was taken under the Future Energy Jobs Act, and specifically what came out of this. So what I've described in the prior slides is what was put into law through Public Act 99-0906. Everyone had great hopes for it and was hoping that it would result in the development of a ton of new wind and solar in Illinois, and especially solar in Illinois. Just to give you some sense of context, before the enactment of FEJA, I believe the trade associations were reporting that the total amount of installed solar capacity in Illinois was around 80 megawatts or so. And maybe 30 of that had come from an initiative that the IPA had conducted across 2015, 2016, the supplemental photovoltaic procurement process to support additional distributed generation projects. And there was one big 20 megawatt project as well. So we're talking about something that's pretty lumpy and also very, very small in terms of scale. So that'll hopefully provide some good context for the results from FEJA in the slides that follow, and to give you some sense of just how the Illinois energy economy has transformed over the last 5 years since the enactment of the Future Energy Jobs Act. So as I mentioned previously, right after FEJA took effect, we were required to conduct what were called the initial 4 procurements. And the goal of these procurement processes was to bring 1 million RECs delivered annually under contract from new utility scale wind projects and 1 million RECs delivered annually from new utility scale solar projects. Now, brownfield site photovoltaic projects were eligible to participate, but if you think about this, you might have a gigantic greenfield solar project, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, that doesn't have these same site remediation needs. Brownfield site projects are inherently more complex to develop, and you have additional remediation costs. You may have more regulatory complexity on top of that. and we're choosing bids on the basis of price, it's always going to be very difficult that even if those projects were eligible to participate, that any of them would be selected. And they, in fact, were not selected through these initial 4 procurement processes. And brownfield sites were supported by subsequent 4 procurement processes that were only specific to the development of brownfield site projects. So those procurements were conducted across late 2017, early 2018, and we met those procurement quantities outside of maybe a few partial bids or partial awards in the margins that ultimately weren't accepted. And then through the ICC's approval of the IPA's long-term renewable resource procurement plan, it also authorized an additional 2 million RECs each from new utility scale wind and new utility scale solar projects. So in addition to this million that we did up front, now we're doing an additional 2 million from each of these categories and bringing that much more under contract and hopefully resulting in that much more project development across Illinois. That long-term plan and the commission's order approving it also called for a brownfield site photovoltaic procurement. We conducted one of those procurements, had no selected bids. That could mean that there were no bids that received that were qualified, that there were no bids received that were at all. That could mean that none of the bids ultimately were below the price benchmark. Unfortunately, all that information is confidential. We can't comment on exactly what happened in the bidding process, but we did hold a comment process thereafter to try to identify any barriers to successful procurement in that process, and then conducted a second brownfield site photovoltaic procurement process. 2 projects were selected. The exact prices for those contracts, or those the prices that were bid in that resulted in rec delivery contracts, are confidential by law. But we're really only talking about 30 megawatts or so of brownfield site photovoltaic project development, 20 to 30 megawatts, and the prices were significantly higher than what we saw through utility scale projects. So let's go to the next slide. So talk a little bit about some of the successes. So we ultimately met what were Future Energy Jobs Act new build targets. So this is the RECs procured from new projects, new utility scale wind and utility scale solar projects. We met and surpassed the 1 million RECs delivered annually by 2020 and the 2 million RECs delivered annually by 2025. For solar, those numbers actually take into account the adjustable block program as well, which met its 2020 targets in addition. But it's the case that ultimately we ended up with corresponding amounts of new utility scale wind and utility scale solar RECs under contract. They basically evened out. There's been a little bit of change in that since, given project attrition. But ultimately, if you were to look at, okay, this is what we expected to have in terms of new development based on the targets that were in the Future Energy Jobs Act, we definitely surpassed those. So that's a great success. This resulted in a tremendous amount of new utility scale renewable energy development in Illinois, especially relative to that 80 megawatts of solar that existed before. As I'd mentioned, we've got a couple of useful slides coming up. One is a map of projects, and after that is a chart on the next slide that shows basically here's the megawatts that are being developed or have been developed. Here's the total amount of RECs that they'll be delivering annually. The prices were extremely competitive. So bidders are coming in and saying, here is the price for RECs that I'll take and I'll be able to successfully develop my project in it. And we're selecting the lowest price that is ultimately bid into that process to have the most cost-effective procurement possible, to get the biggest bang for our buck. And the prices that we saw were utility scale wind, it's in the $3 to $5 range per REC, for utility scale solar in the $4 to $8 range per REC. That was quite a bit lower. It's certainly quite a bit lower than our administratively set prices through the adjustable block program, where you have REC prices that might vary from, say, $35 in the low end to, say, $80 to $90 for the absolute smallest scale rooftop solar project. So we're talking about a huge differential in terms of the bang for our buck from these utility scale projects and the amount of public support that they're receiving. Brownfield site photovoltaics, again, these are much more complicated projects. And we didn't end up with prices that were nearly as competitive as what we had with respect to utility scale projects, but that's just simply what's required to achieve all the different hurdles associated with successful development of brownfield site photovoltaic projects, or at least that was our understanding, or that was reflected in the bids received. So the big takeaway from this is we end up with just a ton of new renewable energy development within Illinois. Due to the application of the Illinois or adjacent state requirements found in the Future Energy Jobs Act, we actually only ended up with one of these projects located outside of Illinois, and it's really just over across the border in Iowa. The rest of the projects that came out of this process are in Illinois. Constitutionally, you can't really have this sort of strict in-state preference, but I do think it's the case that many policymakers who put the Future Energy Jobs Act together probably wanted to see a lot of the economic development and other benefits be felt by the state of Illinois, even if there were limits on the degree to which they could do so. So it may be viewed as successful in that way. You have local counties capture the tax revenue associated with those projects. You have employment within the state. So these projects ultimately, we'll show on the map in the next slide or 2 slides from now. These projects ultimately are across the state, but mostly in the MISO portion of the state. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a map of the utility scale projects that resulted from procurements under the Future Energy Jobs Act. It's actually the first time the IPA has released something along these lines. We started receiving FOIA requests about what happened to the utility scale procurements sometime late last year, and realized that even though we only publish the names of winning bidders and the average winning bid price, there has to be more information that we can publish, because that information exists already publicly in other places, including, where is this project and how big is this project, or different information about who's behind the project, oftentimes for permitting processes or with tracking systems where RECs are actually traded. That information exists. So we're still getting to a place where we're putting information like this up on our website and trying to make sure that stakeholders actually know what's being done through these procurement events, and not just that certain procurement quantities were met. But this gives you a sense of the resultant projects from the procurements conducted from June 1st, 2017 forward under the Future Energy Jobs Act. This does not include the projects that were facilitated through the 2010 long-term power purchase agreements under pre-FEJA legal authority. So it's a good array of projects across the state, pretty even balance between wind and solar projects, maybe a few more solar projects than wind projects, because wind tends to be larger in size, but pretty much located in the MISO portion of Illinois. So the northern portion of the state, the ComEd service territory, that's the PJM portion of the state, the Ameren, Illinois service territory, kind of south of I-80 is how a lot of people talk about it. That's the MISO portion of the state. For whatever reason, we ultimately get to a place where these projects were more competitive. They were chosen on the basis of price. There was no locational preference associated with bid evaluation, and the more competitive bids came in from the MISO portion of the state. And as a consequence, that's where these projects are pretty much being developed. So as we go to the next slide, this provides a bit of a breakdown of exactly where this leaves us in terms of installed capacity of new utility scale wind and new utility scale solar projects, and the amount of RECs we can expect to receive from those projects annually. We also haven't published anything quite like this before. If you were to look at our now withdrawn long-term plan that was published on August 16th of 2021, but withdrawn after the passage of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, we did have some tables that talked a little bit about the attrition rates associated with utility scale projects after contracts are executed, and where things stood in terms of expected REC deliveries. To give you some sense of what I mean by attrition, so, and we can talk about this also in the context of the adjustable block program. Attrition in our eyes is you conduct a procurement event, you award contracts for the development of these projects, and then somewhere between the energization of these projects and that initial contract execution, there's a determination that the project can no longer be successfully developed, and effectively the developer needs to exit their agreement. Now, if that happens, it's the case that they lose collateral associated with it, and they've also gained nothing from the procurement process, because payments are only made once the system is ultimately energized. So from a public waste, fraud, and abuse standpoint, look, that's not a bad outcome. Ultimately, they forfeited collateral, and the state is out the administrative costs associated with procurement, although those might have been covered actually already by the suppliers, but we're not paying for something that was never developed. They're just given the revenue certainty for once the system is developed, then the money will begin flowing in. What we're looking at here in terms of attrition is about a 20 to 25% attrition rate. So of all, in terms of installed capacity, so of all of the projects supported through these procurement processes, let's say it's 2,500 megawatts, or I think 2,600 megawatts is what I had in the prior slide, about 20% of those projects ultimately were not successfully developed. Whereas the 80% are or are still in the process of being developed, and we have no reason to think that they wouldn't be. So that's where you get into the extension granted row there. That's those projects that are under development still, but they're still on the ground, they're moving forward. it's just maybe another 3 to 6 months. And as I'll get into the next slide, COVID's a big driver behind that. It's just created, if we go back to the last slide for now, just real quick. So COVID's a big driver behind that. And that's one of the reasons why you have some of these extension granted projects or pending in this case. What this results in terms of RECs received on an annual basis is in that second table. So you can take this installed capacity and then effectively using the capacity factor, figure out how many RECs you're receiving annually from these projects. And what you see is it ends up being over 4 million RECs received annually from these projects. And ultimately, that's a big contributor going forward to meeting the Illinois RPS. So if we're talking about, say, 130 million megawatt hours of overall retail sales, then 4 million RECs being received annually is about 3% of our progress toward the overall Illinois RPS. And that's fairly significant. And that's all been done just within the last few years. So now we can go to the next slide. And I did note there were some questions about this in the chat. I'm happy to take those up after we run through these slides. There are good answers to them, so we'll get to those eventually. But a few of the challenges that we had in the Future Energy Jobs Act approach, and this will help us get into what's in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act and why. One is brownfield-site definitional issues. So as noted in the prior slide, these sites had to be regulated by one of 4 programs, but the point in time in which a site is being regulated by a program actually varies significantly across the programs. And so we had to kind of figure out a way to produce an ad hoc recency standard, or just make sure that we didn't end up in a situation where we had a site that everyone would consider to be a brownfield site and was at one point regulated by one of those 4 programs, wasn't disqualified unfairly. We also had false positive issues. Specifically, there's a lot of sites that are ultimately just cleared through the Illinois Site Remediation Program for real estate transactions, just to give assurance that there aren't some sort of remediation issues on the site. But that's not the same thing as being a brownfield site. That could just be done for transactional purposes, even if they were regulated by that program. So working through those issues became a little bit of a challenge when it came to figuring out what projects needed to be supported at brownfield sites and how to meet the spirit of brownfield site remediation found in the declaratory paragraphs. The first procurement for brownfield site projects, again, no successful bidders. We did end up having a successful procurement process in our second procurement process, but the targets are really pretty meager when you look at the thousands of megawatts of new utility scale wind and solar development generally, and we're talking about 20 to 30 megawatts of brownfield site projects being developed. And then after a successful utility scale wind procurement, we had 2 utility scale wind procurements that had no successful bidders, held a comment process thereafter. And one of the things that we heard pretty consistently was like, look, you've got this model that has fixed REC prices. So your REC price is $5 or whatever the number is, year over year over year over year over year. But the energy revenues that those developers are receiving from projects, from that project, that will vary significantly depending upon activity in wholesale energy markets. So one year it may be $25 megawatt hour, the next year it could be $40 megawatt hour. And so having a fixed REC price was not all that useful to provide the revenue certainty that was required for successfully financing a project. And ultimately the feedback we got was maybe this model is untenable for meeting the aggressive targets that we would need to meet going forward. So that's the feedback that we received and some of the successes and challenges that we had under the Future Energy Jobs Act. With that, we'll go to the next slide. Oh, a few other challenges as well. Delivery timelines with COVID, this came up a little bit and where the status was with some of the utility scale projects, and certainly came up a lot with adjustable block program projects. Look, when COVID hit, we really didn't know what that meant for the ability to successfully develop renewable energy. And it turns out that it can show up in a number of different ways. So for community solar, it can be subscriber acquisition. It could be things like local permitting processes or getting a school board to meet for a project on a school. There's just all these different ways in which COVID threw a wrench into things. It could be supply chain issues. And one of the things that came out of this was there was actually a change in the first REC delivery deadlines. Initially, for the initial 4 procurements, the first RECs had to be delivered by June 1st, 2021, and that was actually moved to June 1st, 2022 through an act of the General Assembly in recognition of the fact that anytime you're developing something from the ground up, it's very possible for that development to take longer or be more complicated than anybody expected. And so trying to provide some latitude for first REC delivery timelines became a real issue and a real need. We did see some project attrition, 20 to 25% of projects dropped out. Counter argument is, what's the right balance there? Ultimately, you don't want to cover every single risk or contingency that comes up. So it's not quite clear how best to calibrate that, but it is the case that we didn't ultimately have all of those projects that were selected end up being successfully developed. And then lastly, there were projects being developed completely outside of the only RPS through private developers engaged in bilateral contracts with, say, corporate purchasers. That's not a bad thing at all, but it just means that those RECs are being retired by those purchasers and not counted toward the Illinois RPS. So trying to figure out some way to work through that provided a policy challenge that I think shows up a little bit in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So now with that, we'll turn to what things look like going forward. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Doug Sinner, for discussion of what things look like now that the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act has passed. Doug?
All right. Hey, thanks, Brian. That was a good build up to where we are today. And you can go to the next slide, Mega. Overall, with the new act, there's been some big changes scaled to the renewable portfolio. First of all, the budget has grown from approximately $230 million a year to close to $600 million. And it's based on the change in going from 2% to 4.25% of the rates. In addition to big change in the budget, the delivery targets for RECs has changed significantly as well. Currently, the target is 10 million RECs, and that's supposed to grow to 45 million RECs annually by the end of 2030. So that's a significant change there. And the role in the development of our long-term plan, it will be, the first draft will be published in early January, is really going to try to figure out how to manage these changes in the budgets and targets and what the effect has on all the various programs that the IPA administers. And the other change, I think Brian alluded to earlier, the size for utility scale projects, the minimum has increased from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. So not only have we had this big change in the scale with the RPS, there have been some significant changes to utility scale projects. And the first is on price. All the prior procurements have been using a fixed price. Now, going forward, we will be using a floating price for the RECs. And it's going to be based on an index of the energy market at certain hubs. And what it'll essentially end up being is the bidders will submit a strike price, and that will be compared to the energy price at an energy hub, and the difference will be determined what they get paid. And hopefully this will create more interest and more financial ability to develop these projects. Now, because the floating price can really swing wildly based on the energy market, one thing that we're going to look to do in the development of the long-term plan is to establish a price collar on that index. So we'll establish a ceiling and a floor. And what that will do is help in the budgeting impacts of the RPS. Without that, because the energy price or the index can vary significantly, it's very difficult to know what the budget's going to be. And the index will help with that, and it will also help in a long-term plan, because what we'll be doing is, for budgeting purposes, look at a long-term energy forecast to kind of get an idea of what the future expenditures will be for these RECs developed under utility scale. Next slide. Other changes to utility scale is under the areas of diversity, equity, and energy transition grants. One thing that Brian alluded to is a lot of the brownfield sites usually come in with very high prices for the RECs. And one of the things that the new act established is Energy Transition Community Grant Areas. Essentially, this is the ability for essentially brownfield sites that are coal, nuclear, fossil fuel that have either been decommissioned or no longer in operation to get grants for the redevelopment of that property. And then there's other various workforce diversity programs established in the Act that will really promote, hopefully, more development, more participation in the renewable energy space. And then in addition, there have been quite a few new labor requirements enacted that will impact utility scale. The first is the Prevailing Wage Act that will require all projects under or through construction to pay prevailing wage. And in addition to that, there's another requirement that all utility scale projects must submit a labor agreement to be qualified to participate in the procurements. And then the last element that's changed on utility scale is the ability for large customers to participate. Essentially, this is the ability if a customer has a long-term agreement with a utility scale solar project that they obtain the RECs from, these could be used to participate in the program. Essentially, to qualify, it has to be a large customer that has 10 megawatts of peak demand, or a parent corporation that may have many operations within the utility service territory that in aggregate have a peak demand of 10 megawatts. All of this is really enabling them to participate. What will happen is they will get a credit on their utility bill based on the cost of the utility scale procurements that we make. And all the RECs that are retired from these self-direct programs will be netted out from the utility scale procurement requirements. So in general, we're trying to get as much participation as we can to meet the aggressive targets that were established under CEJA. Next slide. All right, there's also been some changes to the Brownfield-site photovoltaic. Go to the next one. And the biggest change is to the definition of a brownfield site, and that is that coal mines are now included in that definition. And under the changes in the solar development targets, we have a total project or a total target of 55% for solar. And of that 55%, that 50% will come from the adjustable block program, 47% from utility scale, and 3% from brownfield. Previously, it had been 2%. And there's going to be some new procurement mechanisms that'll be determined through the development of the long-term plan that, again, we will publish in early January. And we had a stakeholder feedback session yesterday that outlined some of those issues that we're going to look at to try to enhance the procurement for brownfield projects. And you can go to the IPA website and review some of that material. Then the last item here on this slide is community-driven community solar. It's not really a topic of brownfield other than the fact that a lot of the community solar projects that were developed in the past were actually sourced from brownfield sites. And under the new CEJA, we're going to try to get community solar driven or closer to the communities that they would actually serve. Next slide. One thing that was established under CEJA is that we have to do some forward procurements. You can go to the next slide. CEJA was enacted in September of this year, and we have within 240 days to do several procurements. And this is for utility scale wind, solar, and brownfield sites. When we develop the this process, we will determine what the actual quantities for those are. And again, these are elements that were held up, that were presented at our workshop yesterday. And the whole purpose is really to balance having the most competitive procurements as we can with supporting new development to meet those aggressive targets under the new act. And these forward procurements that will be done prior to the approval of the long-term plan by the commission, probably in July, we have to implement these procurements. And a couple things that will not be included in the subsequent procurements is a price collar that was discussed a little bit earlier. And other elements is we're looking in the development of the plan is alternative scoring mechanisms so that we can enhance participation in these projects, especially for the brownfield sites. And those will be those items, the price collar and the scoring and different approaches for brownfield, that will all be in future procurements after the long-term plan has been approved. Next slide. All right, procurements under the long-term plan. You can advance as well. As I mentioned a couple times, we held a workshop yesterday to help with the development of our long-term plan. Comments are due on that December 3rd. You can look at that link to the IPA website to get the slides of the presentation and even the recording that was conducted. In January 13th, we're going to plan to release a draft long-term plan that will be available for comment, and that'll all be based on a lot of these feedback we get from the workshop that was held yesterday. And the whole target of everything is really the intersection of the RPS target, utility scale aspect, and the available funds from the budget. The element or the goal of the long-term plan is to determine how much we will procure annually from utility scale and how often we would run procurement events to acquire those RECs. In addition, we're going to be looking for different approaches to brownfield site procurements so that we can again meet those targets and achieve more development of the brownfield sites for renewables. Next slide. As Megan mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we have some additional upcoming power hours. The next one will be on December 3rd to discuss creating a diverse and equitable energy workforce. And then we have two more on December 10th for decarbonization from coal to renewables. And then one final one on December 17th to discuss carbon mitigation credits and CEJA's support for at-risk nuclear plants. And there at the bottom is a link to register for these upcoming webinars or to view recordings from previous webinars that have been held. Next slide. And then if you want to get information in general on new utility scale wind or brownfield projects, you can look at the link to the IPA website. Next slide. All right, I'll turn this over to Mega for question and answers.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, we have gotten quite a lot of questions. I'll start with my first question. The question says, how many megawatt energy does Illinois use annually in total?
So the information we have is pretty much about just retail sales of electric utilities. So it's not taking into account municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives. And I think 130 million megawatt hours is the number, maybe 125 to 130. I apologize if I'm off on that. I'm sure this is available somewhere, maybe even available in our long-term plan, but probably in the ICC's website, but it's in that range. So when you think about the percentage of that, that gives you some sense of then how many million RECs need to be delivered annually to meet those percentage-based targets. So if you're at 25%, you're looking at about 30 million RECs that are required to be under contract to get to that 25%.
Thanks. The second question is there more information available on the starting delivery dates for various projects than the 1 million by 2020 and 2 million by 2025?
So we have that table of projects. We do not have information about the specific delivery rates, the delivery timelines of individual projects. We had the table that showed those that were already energized, those that were pending, which I understand to be, and I think this might have come up in questions, to be the system is verified as actually being energized and operating, but maybe the first REC deliveries haven't been received by the utilities yet, or there's another step that's required before we kind of move it into a different column, and those that have an extension associated with them. We don't have, the tracking systems may be able to have information about when first RECs were delivered from those projects, but we don't have specific information offhand about the specific dates of energization of those projects.
Thank you. The next question says, does the 359 megawatts include ABP projects? And do you have these on a year-by-year basis to see what was really installed year by year since 2018?
So it's very lumpy on the second part of that question because the procurements were primarily conducted across 2017 and 2018. So we're looking at projects being energized within, say, the last year or so, and then in the next 6 months going forward. So pretty much all of the energization activity is occurring within that time frame. In fact, the initial 4 procurement projects couldn't begin delivering RECs until June 1st, 2019. There was a 2-year window where the first REC deliveries could occur, but many of these projects were not energized until 2021 for those that were energized. With respect to whether those numbers include adjustable block program projects, those tables do not include ABP projects. The numbers for ABP, it's a little different. I think we might have published something in mid-August in our long-term plan as the status of those. If not, it's something that we'll be looking at doing in our next long-term plan. I think in prior presentations, we might have published a table about specifically how many of the 111 or so community solar projects were energized. That number grows almost by the week. So it's a little bit difficult because a lot of those projects are now reaching energization as we speak. So that's an ever-changing number. But the overall amount of megawatts supported through ABP is about 670 megawatts through that initial first wave of the program.
Thanks. There are 2 questions on project extensions. The first question is, how long will the extensions be granted for?
Well, I think it depends. The extensions, we don't ultimately determine that. So I guess I don't want to speak out of turn, but if there's someone who maybe makes a petition to the ICC and has a demonstration of need and says, this is where the project is, here's how much longer it needs, then I guess there's a record created where an extension like that could be granted. There was a 1-year extension that was offered to initial 4 procurement projects under certain circumstances by law already. So we've already seen that happen. And this is just for utility scale projects. For adjustable block program projects, the IPA can and does often play a role with granting extensions for those projects. And for those who participate in that lane, they know that oftentimes it's 12 months, can be 6 months, depends on the request. We tend not to grant more than 12 months at a time though.
Okay. The second part of this question is, what is the difference between pending and extension granted?
Yeah, it's something I addressed just a couple of questions ago. I think pending is, we know the system's up running and likely energized in a colloquial sense, but may not be performing yet because first REC deliveries may not be received.
The next question is, Do the utility scale projects have to be registered in PJM, GATS, or MRES?
Yes, that's generally the platforms through which RECs are being traded from those projects.
Thank you. The next question is, can you expand in the term project labor agreement?
I'm sorry?
Can you expand the term project labor agreement?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Project labor
I
agreements
think just explain it, expand on what it is.
What that is.
Oh, okay. So project labor agreements will be required for utility scale projects and brownfield-site projects moving forward under new section 1-75C1Q2, I think it is, of the IPA Act. And ultimately, we'll be publishing guidance separately on what's required to be contained within a project labor agreement for those projects. I would say go to the law first, and what's in the law there is basically what exists right now in terms of the requirement for those projects, and color that will be added to what's in the law will be added later.
Great, thank you. So this question is pretty long and pretty technical. If it's okay with you, Brian, maybe we can just unmute the participant, or I can just go ahead and address the question.
Just go ahead and address the question, and we can answer the best that we can.
Okay. Doesn't the price collar put developers in a bit of a lurch? If they are essentially bidding all in revenue, how are they expected to survive if below a certain price, they just lose revenue? Is there any clause to recoup any lost revenues if and when prices rebound into the collar range?
So I think this is all something that we can take into consideration in the long-term plan, where ultimately issues related to the price collar will be addressed. We're cognizant of the fact that the nice aspect of the all-in approach is that you don't have that premium built into a REC delivery contract or a bid received, where you're accounting for the edge cases where energy revenues might drop significantly. So I think we have to take that into account, those arguments into account, with the flexibility we also have under section 6108K of the Public Utilities Act of collections, and the scale of collections under section 175C10, or C1E rather. There's all these different issues that we have to kind of take into account to figure out what is the value of making sure that we have budget certainty versus the value to the developer of making sure that they have full revenue certainty. And that will all be worked out through our long-term plan development process, and parties will have plenty of opportunities to comment there.
Okay, thank you. So we can take a few more questions since we've kind of reached our time. So maybe a few more questions.
Sure.
The next question is, doesn't the netting out of RECs from voluntary corporate PPAs defy the whole point of corporate PPAs from the corporation's perspective?
I think if you look at the, it's new section 1-75C1R of the IPA Act that, and you have to look these things up by actual Public Act 1020662 because they don't tend to be found through searching the statute. I don't think the ILCS has been updated yet. But if you look at what's being done or what's being allowed for participation there, it has to be new projects. So ultimately, the goal is to have anyone who qualifies for self-direct, where they're just receiving the credit for the portion of utility scale procurements yet to come, the cost associated with those procurements yet to come, that there's a new project being developed. And ultimately, because a new project has been developed, we're recognizing that and netting out those RECs because it's additional renewable energy development that otherwise would not have occurred. That's at least the theory that I think underpins how all of this comes together. The more direct answer is, regardless of however we assess it, it's what's in the law. So what the point of it is isn't always for us to judge. The question for us is how do we best apply it?
Thank you. So there's two more questions we can address. This question talks about who can we connect with to support the start of a brownfield project?
We don't have resources presently as far as that goes. I think there were a few other comments in chat where there were different links shared. It's just not something that we've ever had the capacity to do. And also, as someone who accepts bids in a competitive procurement process and evaluates those bids, it's not always the best role for the Illinois Power Agency to play to help facilitate the development of individual projects or help assist on some of those pre-development steps.
Thanks. This last question is on the long-term plan, revised long-term plan. The question is, will the 2022 version of the revised long-term plan address co-located battery storage in REC procurements and REC contracts?
Address, I'm not sure here what's meant by address, if it's in terms of different prices, if it's in terms of dedicated procurement requirements. Ultimately, the next version of the long-term plan will apply the law and create avenues for applications of programs in light of the changes in the law. And outside of, say, the separate coal to storage procurement, there aren't changes to, say, the adjustable block program regarding storage. If there are aspects of how systems that are co-located with storage have been treated through our programs that a party would like to raise and see addressed through the long-term plan, they're welcome to do so through comments in our draft plan. As I think Doug had indicated, the draft plan will be out on January 13th of 2022. Comments are taken for the next 45 days thereafter. And if there's some consideration that a party believes needs to be taken into account as to how those projects participate, then that's probably the right time and place to raise it.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. So I think that concludes our Q&A section of the presentation. On behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I want to thank everyone for joining the IPA Power Hour. We appreciate your participation, and I also want to thank our presenters for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present this session. The next IPA Power Hour session will be on the topic of diversity and equity in the clean energy workforce, which is one of CEJA's new requirements and focus for the agency. That session will be held on December 3rd, Friday, December 3rd. So if you have not registered for the webinar yet, you can do so by going to the IPA website, clicking About IPA, and under the drop-down, you will find events. That's where all the registration can take place. So with that, that concludes our presentation for today. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks.